Dr. Jessica Knurick opens the discussion by framing public health as a systemic endeavor, focused not merely on individual choices, but on the infrastructure and policies that shape the ability of populations to live healthier lives. She stresses that public health encompasses the availability of clean water, safe food, clean air, and soil, foundational systems that enable well-being across society. However, these systems have been co-opted or misunderstood, leaving room for misinformation to fill the void caused partly by inadequate public communication. A striking illustration is the vast disparities in life expectancy and chronic disease prevalence across socioeconomic strata in the U.S. Men in the highest income brackets live 15 years longer than those in the lowest, and women have a 10-year gap, underscoring the urgency of addressing social determinants such as built environment, income inequality, and food access. Dr. Knurick suggests that policies and programs must prioritize these root causes to improve public health outcomes broadly, rather than narrow focus on superficial or cosmetic health issues. At the core of institutional distrust is the perceived intertwining of regulatory agencies like the FDA with big pharmaceutical and food corporations. Dr. Knurick acknowledges a kernel of truth in concerns over industry influence, but she carefully disentangles complexity from conspiracy. She explains that nearly half of the FDA's funding comes from industry user fees, a system established in the 1990s to alleviate chronic underfunding and expedite drug approvals. This funding mechanism is not synonymous with corruption, but reflects political choices and systemic underinvestment in public health infrastructure. The consequence is a compromised system where reliance on industry funds hampers the FDA's independence, while Congress fails to provide adequate funding. Dr. Knurick and public health advocates call for reversing this dependency by increasing taxpayer funding to safeguard regulatory integrity. Meanwhile, private corporate funding in scientific research presents additional complexities. About 40% of research funds come from industry, primarily for profit-motivated drug trials or product development. Thankfully, layers of peer review, transparency, and disclosure partially shield scientific outcomes, though challenges persist. Dr. Knurick highlights the dangers of focusing purely on funding sources without considering the rigorous scientific processes that vet research or the consequences of defunding essential public agencies. One of Dr. Knurick's distinguishing qualities is her empathetic approach toward individuals caught up in health misinformation campaigns. She reveals that she too once grappled with confusion before deep study enlightened her perspective. This compassion drives her communication strategy, correcting inaccurate narratives without alienation, understanding why people may eschew institutional advice or conflate wellness trends with scientific public health. With the explosion of social media, many succumb to fear-based or conspiratorial content, especially regarding nutrition or personal health during vulnerable life stages like pregnancy. Dr. Knurick stresses the importance of meeting audiences where they are, using accessible language, and fostering understanding rather than appealing to authority alone. Her experience shows that outreaches grounded in empathy open pathways for collective health literacy and trust rebuilding in an era of institutional skepticism. A key conceptual distinction Dr. Knurick draws is between personal wellness and public health. Wellness revolves around individual responsibility for lifestyle choices, personal nutrition, and fitness, often promoted by private wellness movements. Public health, by contrast, assesses and intervenes on systemic layers, policy, economics, environment, that determine the accessibility and equity of healthy options at the population level. This dichotomy reveals why wellness trends frequently misinterpret or oversimplify health challenges rooted in structural inequity. For example, advising individual consumers to eat better neglects that many have limited access to affordable fresh foods. Dr. Knurick warns against conflating personal behavior change efforts with broader public system reforms. She urges acknowledgement of the powerful social determinants shaping health disparities, which requires governmental and institutional solutions beyond individual action. The discussion turns to the controversial MAHA movement, which, Dr. Knurick explains, successfully taps into genuine frustrations about chronic disease prevalence, ultra-processed food dominance, and corporate influence over the food supply. However, the movement misattributes causes, focusing excessively on peripheral issues such as food dyes and seed oils, rather than systemic policy failures and social determinants. This misdiagnosis leads to misguided solutions that either lack meaningful impact or, worse, result in harm. For instance, bans on fluoride or targeting minimally harmful food additives distract from necessary reforms in food production, agricultural subsidy allocation, and environmental protection. Dr. Knurick views the MAHA movement's emphasis on these elements as a Trojan horse that diverts public attention from the root causes, impeding progress, while the systems that harm public health remain intact and even weakened. An illustrative example of misinformation she addresses is the focus on seed oils, such as canola and sunflower oils, as villains in modern diets. Dr. Knurick clarifies that the term seed oils is relatively new and not commonly used in nutrition science, which instead studies polyunsaturated fatty acids and vegetable oils more comprehensively. Contrary to popular contemporary claims, decades of epidemiological data show no adverse effects from seed oils. In fact, they can be more heart-healthy than saturated fats. The popularity of seed oil fear-mongering has roots in broader movements harkening back to ancestral diets, emphasizing foods like beef tallow. Yet evidence indicates saturated fats in items like beef tallow likely worsen cardiovascular risk when replacing seed oils. While avoiding ultra-processed foods generally improves diet quality and health, vilifying one ingredient distracts from the larger issue of overall food quality, affordability, and accessibility. Dr. Knurick reflects on how the wellness movement, historically associated with progressive circles, has converged paradoxically with right-wing distrust of institutions since the COVID-19 pandemic. Both critique corporate power, but arrive at different conclusions. The left desires more regulation to protect public health, while the right often calls for deregulation, favoring individual responsibility and skepticism of science. This ideological horseshoe results in conflicting narratives about food safety, regulation, and health policies. The right's mistrust of scientific regulation dovetails with deregulation agendas, complicating coherent public health responses. The wellness movement's initial critique of corporate greed becomes distorted into anti-regulatory stances fueled by conspiracy theories, making consensus and effective policymaking more elusive. Delving further into structural explanations, Dr. Knurick describes how U.S. agricultural subsidies overwhelmingly favor commodity crops like corn, soy, and wheat. Approximately 80% of corn production is directed toward animal feed and fuel, leaving a small fraction for human food that largely goes into ultra-processed products laden with cheap ingredients such as high-fructose corn syrup. This dependence on large-scale monoculture incentivizes the production of highly processed and calorically dense but nutrient-poor foods, which dominate grocery store aisles. The consolidation of the food industry into a few powerful corporations perpetuates this system, prioritizing profit and shareholder value over public nutrition. Subsequently, local food systems and fresh produce become comparatively expensive and inaccessible, especially in low-income urban areas, deepening food deserts and systemic inequities. Dr. Knurick critiques recent legislative actions, particularly the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which includes substantial tax cuts benefiting the wealthy while cutting hundreds of billions from Medicaid and nutrition assistance programs like SNAP. These cuts threaten the health of millions by reducing healthcare coverage and access to nutritious food for vulnerable populations. Moreover, work requirements added to Medicaid create bureaucratic hurdles that deny coverage to many who qualify without demonstrably increasing employment. Cutting funding to SNAP education programs further undermines public health goals. Such policy moves exacerbate income inequality and food insecurity, worsening the very health outcomes policymakers claim to address. Dr. Knurick stresses that investments in social safety nets and preventive care make both ethical and economic sense by reducing long-term healthcare costs and strengthening the national health fabric. A central theme is the failure of scientists and public health experts to communicate effectively with the public. Dr. Knurick acknowledges that scientific language is often inaccessible, and academia historically discouraged social media engagement, ceding ground to misinformation spreaders. The pandemic heightened this issue, exposing gaps in transparent and empathetic communication and allowing distrust to flourish. To rebuild credibility, scientists must demystify their work, avoid jargon, and embrace transparency, including acknowledging past errors. Offering clear explanations about processes such as FDA funding or scientific consensus empowers people to understand complexities rather than succumb to oversimplified conspiracies. Science is provisional and self-correcting, yet public messaging often misses this nuance, creating fertile ground for pseudoscience to grow. The podcast addresses comparisons often made between the United States and European countries regarding food quality and health outcomes. While European nations generally maintain stricter food regulations and prioritize public health in policymaking, Dr. Knurick cautions against simplistic narratives. The differences between FDA and European Food Safety Authority regulations, although present, are sometimes exaggerated. For example, the U.S. actually allows fewer synthetic food dyes than some European countries. Cultural factors also shape diet and lifestyle. Europeans typically shop more frequently at local markets, consume fresher whole foods, benefit from universal health systems, and live in more walkable urban environments. Underlying social determinants, such as income inequality, environmental policy, and infrastructure, contribute substantially to health outcomes.